The chair scraped against the worn pine floorboards with a sound like a gunshot, and Virginia Dalton's heart stopped beating for a full 3 seconds. She had not heard anyone come through her door. She had not heard boots on her porch steps, had not heard the latch lift, had not heard the hinges creak the way they always did when the wind pushed hard from the north. And yet there he was, seated at her supper table as though he had always belonged there, a man carved from shadow and sun-bleached bone. Trail dust worked so deep into the creases of his face that it looked like geography. His hat sat low over eyes the color of creek water in November, and his hands, those broad and calloused hands, lay flat and still on either side of the plate she had set for herself alone. He looked at the pot of rabbit stew she had left steaming in the center of the table. He looked at the single tin cup of coffee she had poured. He looked at the rough-cut bread sitting on the cloth she used as a tablecloth, because real linens were a luxury that belonged to another life she had once briefly touched. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at a landscape he knows he does not deserve to inhabit, with a raw and aching longing held in place by iron control. Then he said, quietly, with a voice that had clearly not been used for conversation in a very long time, "I have not eaten a warm meal worth remembering." Virginia did not scream. She did not reach for the shotgun she kept behind the door or the small pistol she wore at her hip whenever she was not inside her own house. She stood instead in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, holding her ladle like a scepter, and she stared at this man who had walked into her home and sat at her table and confessed something so achingly simple that it landed in her chest like a stone thrown into still water. She should have been afraid. Every piece of practical wisdom she had accumulated in her 28 years on this earth, every hard lesson the frontier had beaten into her since she had come to the New Mexico territory 3 years ago, told her to be afraid. A man she did not know had entered her home without permission. He wore a Colt single-action Army revolver on his right hip and a second one cross-drawn on his left. The leather of his holsters was old and dark with use, the kind of worn that only came from a man who drew those weapons regularly and had been doing so for years. But there was something in his face that was not threat. There was something that was confession. Something that was, beneath all the dust and the hardness and the careful stillness, an admission so vulnerable it nearly broke her open just to witness it. She said, "Then sit still and I will bring you a bowl." And that was where it truly began. Virginia Dalton had arrived in the New Mexico territory in the spring of 1881, 3 weeks after her husband Thomas had been shot dead outside the assay office in Santa Fe by a man whose name she had not yet known but would come to know very well in the months that followed. Thomas had not been a bad man. He had been a weak one, which was in some ways a more dangerous thing, because weak men made alliances with powerful men and called it survival, and eventually the powerful men collected what they were owed. She had come west with Thomas because she had loved him, or believed she had loved him, with the particular faith of a 25-year-old woman from Ohio who had read too many newspapers, and not enough of the actual accounts of people who had survived the crossing and the settling. Thomas had promised her a cattle operation, a modest one, something workable and real. What he had built instead in the 18 months before his death was a series of debts to a man named Elias Cutter, who operated out of the town of Redemption, New Mexico, which was 30 miles northeast of Virginia's property, and which had been named with either tremendous irony or tremendous optimism by whoever had first staked a claim there. Elias Cutter was not a lawman. He was something the territory had not yet found proper language for, a man who filled the space between legitimate authority and outright criminal enterprise and called it commerce. He ran the bank, the general store, and the livery in Redemption. He employed 4 men who wore guns and who were not deputies but who acted like them when it suited Cutter's purposes. He had extended Thomas credit twice, and Thomas had used the credit for cattle purchases that had not worked out the way he planned, and when Thomas died, The debt had not died with him. It had transferred, the way debts do when a man dies, leaving a widow with land. Virginia had learned all of this slowly and painfully in the weeks following Thomas's death, sitting across from men in offices who spoke to her in gentle and condescending tones about obligations and legal realities, and the nature of territorial property law as it applied to surviving spouses. She had learned that the man who had shot Thomas outside the assay office had been found dead himself 3 days later in an alley, which she had not caused, but which she had not mourned. She had learned that the modest ranch operation Thomas had described in his letters home to her before she had made the journey west was in fact 50 acres of scrubland with a small house on it, a barn that needed significant repair, and 7 cattle. She had also learned, because she was Virginia Dalton and she had never in her life sat still long enough to be entirely defeated, that she was good with animals, that she was a capable and intuitive gardener, and that the land, despite its apparent hostility, was willing to negotiate with a person patient enough to listen to it. By the time James Ford sat down at her supper table in October of 1883, Virginia had expanded her small operation to include a kitchen garden that produced through most of the year, a small flock of chickens, 12 cattle, and a reputation in the nearest settlement of Millhaven as a woman who bought fair and paid honest. She still owed Elias Cutter money. She owed him considerably less than she had when Thomas died, but she owed him enough that he had twice sent men to her property to remind her of that fact, and once of those visits had required her to demonstrate, with the loaded shotgun, that she understood the nature of her own property lines. She lived alone. She had a neighbor, an older Mexican man named Esteban Reyes, who farmed a plot 2 miles to the west and who occasionally sent his granddaughter over with tortillas wrapped in cloth, and Virginia paid that kindness forward whenever she could. But she had no companion, no partner, no one who sat across from her at the table she had built herself from boards she had cut herself, and sometimes the silence of the evenings was so complete and so heavy that she had to go stand outside and look at the stars, just to remember that the world was larger than the 4 walls of her own making. She had been doing exactly that, standing on her porch looking at the October sky, when she had heard a horse stop somewhere near her barn and then nothing, no further movement, no voice calling out. She had gone inside for the ladle she had forgotten on the counter, and she had not checked the front room, because she had not thought to check the front room, because she was 30 miles from anything that qualified as a town and nobody came to her door without a reason she could account for. And then the chair had scraped. James Ford had not planned to stop at Virginia Dalton's property. He had not planned to stop anywhere. Planning, in the sense that ordinary people use the word, had become a luxury he had systematically stripped from his life over the past 4 years, replacing it with movement and a kind of hollow discipline that kept him functional without requiring him to feel very much about the direction he was traveling. He had been born in 1855 in Missouri, the second of 3 sons to a farming family that had survived the war by being too poor to be worth raiding and too stubborn to leave. His father had died in 1872, not from violence but from the accumulated weight of hard seasons, and James had been the one who stayed and worked the land while his older brother went to Kansas City to find work, and his younger brother followed 2 years later. By 1876, the farm was gone, sold to cover debts that had grown in the way debts do when a young man is working alone against weather and market prices and the fundamental cruelty of Missouri clay soil. He had drifted south and west, taking work where he could find it, and the work he could find most reliably was the kind that made use of his particular accuracy with a firearm and his apparent inability to be frightened. He had done bounty work for 3 years, which was legal and sometimes even righteous depending on who you were bringing in and why. He had done 2 stints as a hired gun for ranching operations in disputes that had not been entirely clean in their ethics, but which he had been able to justify to himself at the time. He had done one job he could not justify to himself, and which he thought about every night with a clarity that sleep could not blur. A job in 1879, in which a man named Theodore Marsh had given him instructions that turned out to be a great deal more complicated than their initial description had suggested. He would not think about 1879 right now. He had trained himself, with considerable effort, not to think about it unless the darkness was very complete, and the distance between himself and other human beings was so great that thinking about it would not result in anything visible happening to his face. What he would think about, what he had been thinking about when his horse had stopped at Virginia Dalton's property, because the horse was tired and smelled water, and James had been in the saddle for 11 hours and had simply failed to override the animal's better judgment, was the fact that he was 28 years old and had not eaten a meal cooked for him by another person in 14 months. He had eaten in saloons and roadhouses, and once, memorably, in the kitchen of a mission church in southern Arizona, where a Spanish priest had fed him postle and asked him no questions, and for which James had been grateful in a way he had not been able to adequately express. But those were not meals. They were fuel. They were the maintenance of a body he sometimes was not certain he deserved to maintain. A warm meal worth remembering, the kind made with care in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and herbs, the kind set on a table by a person who thought about the person they were feeding. He had not had one of those in so long that the concept had become almost mythological, something from another life that might not have been his. He had not intended to say it out loud. He had sat down at the table because his legs had taken him there, and he had looked at the simple and careful meal laid out for one, and the words had come out of him before he had the operational sense to stop them. And Virginia Dalton had not screamed or reached for her weapon or ordered him out of her house. She had looked at him with those green eyes that held the specific quality of a person who had processed a great deal of difficulty and had arrived on the other side of it without becoming hard, only clear, and she had said she would bring him a bowl. She set a bowl in front of him and poured coffee into a second cup and sat down across from him with the directness of a woman who had learned that hesitation was more dangerous than action. She said, "You will tell me your name before you eat." "That is my only condition." He said, "James Ford," she said, "Virginia Dalton. This is my property, my house, and my meal. You came in through an unlocked door, which I will be correcting starting tonight." He said, "That is reasonable." She said, "Eat." He ate. He ate the rabbit stew with the focus and the controlled intensity of a man who was disciplined even in his hunger, and it was good stew, made with root vegetables she had pulled from her garden, and seasoned with dried herbs she grew in clay pots on her windowsill, and it was warm, and it was made with care, and something happened to James Ford's face while he was eating it that he would later describe to himself, in the privacy of his own mind, as the sensation of a door opening in a wall he had forgotten had a door. Virginia watched him eat and said nothing for a while, because she was a woman who understood the value of silence and did not fill it out of anxiety. She drank her coffee and broke a piece of bread and considered the man across from her with the same practical attention she brought to everything that appeared on her land and needed to be assessed. He was not, she thought, a man who traveled for pleasure. The gear she had briefly seen on his horse as she had walked back to the house was functional to the point of severity, nothing decorative, nothing extra, the possessions of a man who had made a series of deliberate subtractions from his life until only the essential remained. The guns she had already noted. His hands she noted again because hands told you things. They were a working man's hands, not soft, but the calluses were not entirely those of a rancher or a farmer. They were the calluses of a man who worked with rope and leather and firearms and who had been doing so for a long time. She said, "Where are you going?" He said, "South." She said, "South is not a destination." He looked up at her. In the lamplight, his eyes were more gray than the creekwater color she had first assessed, and they held the particular quality of a person who had become unaccustomed to being spoken to directly. As though directness was a thing that happened to other people in other places, and he was an observer of it rather than a participant. He said, "No, it is not," she said. "Are you running towards something or away from something?" A pause. The lamp flickered in a draft from the gap she had not yet gotten around to plugging in the south wall. He said, "I am not certain there is a meaningful difference anymore." She thought about that. She said, "There is. The difference is whether the thing you are moving toward can eventually be arrived at." He set down his spoon. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man recalibrating. He said, "What are you running toward?" She said, "Staying." And she smiled briefly, the kind of smile that was not for him but for the truth of what she had said. "I was running toward staying in one place and building something that was mine. I believe I have arrived." He looked around the room with its rough-cut boards and its clay pots of herbs and its carefully mended curtains and its single bookshelf with a modest collection of volumes that included, she would eventually tell him, a Bible she did not read religiously but consulted occasionally for its poetry, a medical reference text, 2 novels, and a seed catalog from 1881 that she had read so many times it was held together with twine. He said, "Yes, I think you have." She fed him more bread. She poured him more coffee. She did not ask him to leave, and he did not volunteer to go, and they sat in the lamplight for a long time in the kind of silence that was not uncomfortable but was, in the way of all things that are unexpectedly significant, impossible to fully explain. He slept in her barn that night because she told him he could, and because his horse needed rest and grain. She gave him a blanket from the chest at the foot of her bed and told him that if he was gone before dawn she would not think badly of him, and if he was still there she would make breakfast. He was still there. She made eggs and potatoes with dried onion and the last of a small piece of salted pork she had been rationing, and he ate it at the table while she stood at the stove with her back to him, and he said, "This is also a warm meal worth remembering." She turned around and looked at him. She said, "Good." He helped her with her morning work without being asked. He repaired the barn door latch that had been failing for 2 months, using tools he found in her small collection, and working with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew how to use his hands for things other than violence. He checked her horse's shoes and told her that the left front was loose and would need attention before long. He restretched the wire on a section of her fence that the cattle had been pushing against. She watched him work and thought about the nature of unexpected things. He was still there at noon. She made cornbread and heated beans from the pot she kept on the back of the stove, and he ate with her and they talked about the land, about the quality of the soil in her garden, and the way the water ran across her property from the spring to the east, and she asked him questions about cattle, because he had worked enough ranching operations to have opinions. And his opinions were practical and useful, and reflected actual knowledge, rather than the kind of confident ignorance she had encountered too often in men who thought her questions were invitations to perform expertise. He was still there at nightfall. He said over the supper she made from the last of the rabbit and some dried corn and the remainder of the root vegetables, "I should move on tomorrow," she said. "Should you?" He said. "I have no particular right to be here." She said, "You are not here by right. You are here because I have permitted it. There is a difference." She looked at him across the table. "Why do you want to leave?" He was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was picking up, the kind of wind that came before weather, and both of them could hear it moving around the corners of the house with a searching quality, as though it was looking for gaps. He said, "Because staying somewhere requires you to be something you can account for," she said, "and you cannot account for what you are." He said, "Not entirely," she said. "Tell me what you cannot account for." He said, "That is a great deal to ask." She said, "I know, tell me anyway." The fire burned down a little before he spoke. He told her about the job in 1879, about Theodore Marsh, about the man named Calvin Webb who had been described to him as a rustler and a killer, but who had turned out to be something considerably more complicated. A man with a family, 2 children, who had been stealing cattle from Marsh not out of greed, but because Marsh had been systematically buying up land using fraudulent deed transfers, and Calvin Webb had been trying to feed his children in the winter of a year when the weather had destroyed the crops of everyone in the valley. James had found Calvin Webb, and the confrontation had not gone the way he had planned, and Calvin Webb was dead, and James Ford had never entirely recovered from the understanding of what he had done, and why he had done it, and who he had done it for. He said it flatly, without drama, the way a man reports facts he has examined so many times they have worn smooth. But his hands, flat on the table, were pressed down harder than they needed to be. Virginia did not say anything immediately. She did not offer him absolution, because she was not a priest, and she knew that absolution offered too quickly was not absolution at all but just noise. She sat with what he had told her for a moment, honestly giving it the weight it required. Then she said, "You have been carrying that alone for 4 years." He said, "Yes," she said, "that is a very long time to carry something alone." He said, "There is no one else to carry it." She said, "No, but you do not have to carry it while moving. You can set it down and look at it from a fixed position." She paused. "That is what staying is for, not to forget the heavy things, to stop running with them." Something moved in his face. Something shifted behind those gray eyes. He said, "Virginia Dalton." She said, "James Ford." He said, "I do not know what I am doing here." She said, "Neither do I. But I think it is something." He stayed another day, and then another. The weather that the wind had been predicting arrived on the 3rd day as a cold, driving rain that made the idea of travel not merely unpleasant but genuinely impractical. And James found himself engaged in the thorough repair of the section of roof over Virginia's kitchen that had been slowly losing its integrity, and which, in the rain, was demonstrating that integrity in the most concrete possible terms by admitting water in 3 places. He worked on the roof in the rain, which she told him was unnecessary and also somewhat ridiculous, and he said the roof was not going to repair itself, and he had started the assessment, and it would be untidy to leave it unfinished. And she brought him coffee in a tin cup and stood below looking up at him with an expression that she could not quite keep neutral. She was not, she told herself firmly, developing feelings for a man who had broken into her house and eaten her supper. That was not a foundation on which a person built a feeling. That was an incident. The incident, however, had very blue-gray eyes and competent hands, and a quality of listening when she spoke that she had not experienced in a very long time. The quality of a person who was genuinely interested in what you were saying rather than waiting for their turn to speak. And Virginia was honest enough with herself to know that this particular quality undid her in a way that physical attractiveness alone never could. She was also honest enough to acknowledge that he was physically attractive, in the particular way of a man who had been shaped by outdoor physical work, and who wore that shaping without vanity or awareness of it, which was considerably more potent than a man who was aware of his own appearance and managed it deliberately. She told herself these things in the privacy of her own mind, and went back inside and stirred the pot of chili she had started that morning, and did not examine the fact that she had made far more than she needed for herself alone. He came in when the rain was at its heaviest, ducking through the door and pulling it shut behind him with the particular care of a man who understood that houses required maintenance and that doors should be treated gently. He was soaked through. She handed him a cloth and pointed at the fire and went to the bedroom and came back with a dry shirt that had been Thomas's, which was too broad in the shoulders and short in the arms for James, but which was dry. And she set it on the chair near the fire and went back to the stove without looking at him directly. He changed shirts without commentary, and she served the chili, and they ate together in the firelight while the rain worked on the windows with a steady, persuasive rhythm that made the inside of the house feel very small and very warm and very separate from the rest of the world. He said, while eating the chili, which was made with dried chili peppers she had grown herself and beans and the last of a portion of beef she had kept in the cold box. "This is extraordinary," she said. "It is ordinary food." He said, "It is the way it is made that makes it extraordinary." He looked at her directly. "You cook the way you do everything, with complete attention." She set down her spoon. She said, "Is that a compliment or an observation?" He said, "Both. I have been watching you work for 3 days. You do not do anything carelessly. You think about the thing you are doing while you are doing it. That is rarer than people understand." She felt the warmth of that move through her chest and settle somewhere around her sternum, and she addressed her chili with considerable attention to avoid showing him her face for a moment. She said, "My mother taught me that half-done things cost twice as much in the end." He said, "Your mother was right," she said. "She was right about a great many things. I did not always appreciate that while she was alive to tell me." He said, "Where is she now?" She said, "Ohio, with my father who is also still living. They think I am out here making a success of things." He said, "Are you not?" She said, "I'm making something. I'm not certain success is the right word for what a woman alone on 50 acres in the New Mexico territory constitutes." She paused. "Survival, perhaps, persistence." He said, "I have seen a great deal of the territory in the last several years. Most people do not manage what you have managed here. What you have built is real." She looked at him then, and he held her gaze. And in the firelight, with the rain on the windows and the chili going cold in both their bowls, Virginia Dalton understood that she was in serious danger of falling in love with a man she had known for 3 days who had entered her home without permission, and who had, by his own honest accounting, done a terrible thing in 1879 for which he had not forgiven himself. She thought about what terrible things were, and what people did with them, and whether a man who carried his worst deeds so openly and with such obvious pain was more trustworthy than a man who had no worst deed to speak of, or claimed he did not. She thought Thomas had never told her anything he was ashamed of. Thomas had kept his dealings with Elias Cutter hidden from her until they were irreversible, and she had not known until after his death that she had been living on borrowed time that she had never been informed was borrowed. James Ford told her the worst thing he had done within 2 days of sitting at her table. She did not know what to do with that except to think it was significant. The rain continued for 2 more days. James fixed the kitchen roof completely, replaced a section of fence that was beyond salvaging by repair, cut and stacked a winter's worth of firewood from the dead trees at the edge of her property, and rehung her bedroom door, which had been dragging on the floor for months. He did these things without discussion or negotiation, simply identifying what needed doing and doing it, and Virginia fed him 3 meals a day and tried not to think about what it would feel like when he left. On the 5th morning, the rain stopped. The sky came in blue and clean and very cold, the particular clarity of October in New Mexico that felt like a gift after weather, and James was in the barn when she went out to feed the chickens, and she thought he would tell her now that he was leaving. He came out of the barn leading his horse, and he looked at the clean blue sky and then at her, and he said, "I spoke to your neighbor this morning." "Esteban Reyes," she said. "You walked 2 miles to speak to my neighbor." He said, "I walked 2 miles to speak to your neighbor. He told me about Elias Cutter." The name landed in the clean morning air like a stone dropped in water, and Virginia felt her stomach tighten in the particular way it tightened when she thought about Cutter, which was a complex mixture of anger and wariness and a bone-deep exhaustion at the persistence of the obligation. She said, "Esteban should not have told you that," he said. "He told me because he is worried about you. He said Cutter's men were here 3 weeks ago." She said, "They were. I handled it." He said you had a shotgun." She said, "I did, I still do. It is a reliable method." He said, "How much do you owe him?" She said, "That is not your concern, James." He said, "I would like it to be my concern." The morning was very still. Her chickens moved around the yard with their peculiar fastidious urgency, and the cattle made their sounds from the pasture, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the watercourse a bird was announcing the end of the rain, And Virginia looked at James Ford with his horse beside him and his hat in his hand, which was the first time she had seen him hold his hat in his hand. And she thought about what it meant for a man who had been moving for 4 years to say he would like something to be his concern. She said, "Why?" he said. "Because I am done running south toward nothing." He looked at her steadily without pretense. "Because I sat at your table and ate a meal made with care, and it was the first time in 4 years I remembered what it felt like to be a person who inhabits a place rather than moving through it." He paused. "Because I think you are remarkable, and I would rather be here than anywhere else I have thought of going." Virginia Dalton had not cried when Thomas was shot. She had not cried when the men from the bank explained the debt situation to her in their gentle, condescending tones. She had not cried when Cutter's men came to her property the first time, and she had looked down the barrel of her shotgun at a man who outweighed her by 80 pounds and told him to leave. She had not cried through any of the 3 years of difficult and solitary and frequently frightening work she had done to build the life she had. She felt her eyes go bright now, and she blinked it back with the same decisive quality she brought to everything else, and she said, "The debt to Cutter is $412. I have been paying it down by $100 a year, which is the most I can manage on what this operation produces." He said, "4 years more." She said, "If nothing goes wrong, if the cattle stay healthy and the garden produces and he does not find a reason to accelerate the timeline." He said, "Does he want the land?" She said, "He wants every parcel between here and the water source in the hills. He has been buying land up for 3 years and mine sits exactly between 2 parcels he already holds." She paused. "He told me once that my land would eventually be his one way or another. I believe he intended it as a statement of patient confidence. I received it as a threat." James put his hat back on his head. He did it deliberately, with the specific quality of a decision being made. He said, "Let me stay through the winter. I can work the operation and add to what you are able to produce. Between us, we can accelerate the repayment." She said, "I am not hiring you." He said, "I am not asking to be hired." She said, "What are you asking?" He said, "To be here, to be useful to something real." A pause, and then with a directness that she recognized as costing him something. "To sit at your table and learn what it means to stay." She looked at him for a long time. She considered all the practical objections and all the emotional dangers and all the reasonable arguments for self-protection. She considered the 4 years of solitude and the hard-won stability of her particular independence. She considered the persistent reality of Elias Cutter and the $412 and the increasing sense she had been trying not to have that the next time his men came to her property with their patient, confident menace, a shotgun alone might not be sufficient. She said, "You will sleep in the barn." He said, "Yes." She said, "You will not come into the house without being asked." He said, "Understood." She said, "If at any point I ask you to leave, you will leave without argument." He said, "I will." She said, "Then you can stay." October became November with the particular abruptness of the high desert, the temperature dropping with a seriousness that meant business, and James Ford and Virginia Dalton fell into a routine that was practical on its surface, and something considerably more complicated underneath. He was up before she was every morning, had the animals fed and the barn tended by the time she came out with coffee, and she had started making 2 cups without thinking about it within the first week. They drank coffee in the cold morning air on her porch and talked about the day's work, and then they worked, sometimes together and sometimes separately, and they ate 3 times a day at the table she had built herself and talked with the growing ease of 2 people discovering that they thought about the world in complementary ways. He was better read than she had expected, which should not have surprised her but did. He had carried a small number of books in his saddlebags, she discovered, when she saw him reading one evening by the fire in the barn, and she asked what he was reading, and he showed her a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which was water-stained and had clearly been read many times, and she said she had never read it and he said she should, and the next evening he left it on the porch for her. She read it in 3 evenings and left it back on the porch, and he said, "What did you think?" And she said, I think a Roman emperor who commanded an army had a great deal to say about the virtue of accepting what you cannot control, and I wonder if he was writing that for himself or for someone else. And James Ford looked at her with such unguarded admiration that she had to look away. They talked about books, about the land, about the practical and philosophical challenges of building something permanent in a place that was itself still being negotiated. They talked about the territory's complicated history, which James knew more of than she did, having traveled it for years, the displacement of the Apache people by the army and the treaties that kept being made and broken, the land grants that had been issued and then disputed, the way the frontier was always being described as empty and available when it was in fact full of people and history and competing claims. He said once, "The West is always presented as a place where a man can start fresh. No one mentions what was already here that had to be moved for that fresh start to be available." She said, "No, they never mention that." She paused. "I think about it with this land. Whether Thomas's deed was legitimate, whether whoever sold it to Thomas had the right to sell it in the first place." He said, "You cannot always resolve that question, but asking it is something." She said, "It does not feel like enough." He said, "It rarely is, but it is more than most people manage." In the evenings, after supper, they sometimes played cards, a habit they had fallen into after she found a worn deck in the drawer of the small table near her fireplace, and had challenged him to a game of cribbage, at which he turned out to be formidable, and she turned out to be better, and the competition between them had a warmth to it that was something other than simply passing time. He won the third game in a succession and looked up at her with something that was very close to happiness, and she thought she had never seen him look quite like that before, uncomplicated, present, unshadowed, and she said, "You look different when you are winning." He said, "I look different when I am here." She said, "Here at my table," he said, "here with you." The room was very quiet. The fire was burning low. The cards were between them on the table and the lamp was turned down for the evening, and there was approximately 2 feet of space between where he was sitting and where she was sitting, and Virginia Dalton was aware of every inch of it with a physical precision she found both compelling and alarming. She said, "James." He said, "Virginia." She said, "I need you to be honest with me about something." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you here because of Elia's cutter? Did someone send you here?" The question landed between them, and she watched his face, and she saw not offense but understanding, the understanding of a man who knew exactly why the question was necessary. He said, "No one sent me. My horse stopped at your water trough because he was tired and I let him, and I came in through your door because the light was on inside, and because I had been alone for so long that I walked toward a light without thinking." He met her gaze without flinching. "I had not heard of Elia's cutter before Esteban told me about him. My coming here was an accident," she said. "Accidents of this kind make me nervous." He said, "I know. You have been given good reasons to be suspicious of convenience." A pause. "I am not convenient, Virginia. I am a man with a dark history who sat at your table without permission and told you the worst thing he ever did on the second night of knowing you. I am not anyone's useful tool. I am just a person who found a place worth staying in." She believed him. She believed him with the specific instinct of a woman who had learned the hard way to distinguish between performance and truth, and she thought that if she was wrong about this, then she was wrong about everything and there was no point building any more defenses. She said, "Then stay." He said, "I intend to." She did not say anything more. But she reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, and the warmth of it moved through both of them like the first real heat of spring after a hard winter. And then she stood and said good night and went to her room, and James Ford sat at the cleared table in the low light for a long time before he went to the barn. November brought 2 things that changed the nature of their situation materially. The first was a successful cattle sale in Millhaven, where James brought 4 of Virginia's 12 cattle and negotiated a price that was 30% better than what she had been receiving, because he had the experience and the particular manner of a man who was not going to be talked down, and when he came back he put the money on the table and said, "Enough to pay Cutter $200 this month." She stared at the bills. She said, "That is twice what I have ever paid at once." He said it should accelerate the timeline. She said, "It will. James, that is $200 toward 412, if I can manage another payment in the spring." He said, "We should be able to manage another payment in the spring." The second thing November brought was Elias Cutter himself. He arrived on a Thursday morning in the middle of November, riding a well-kept roan with two of his men behind him, and he pulled up at her gate with the easy confidence of a man who had never in his life been required to knock. He was perhaps 50 years old, broad-shouldered, with a carefully maintained appearance that communicated money and authority in the studied way of a man who understood that appearance was its own kind of weapon. He wore a fine coat and a respectable hat, and he sat his horse with the relaxed posture of a man on a social call. James was mending fence on the south side of the property when Cutter arrived, and Virginia was at the house, and she came to the porch with her arms crossed and said, "Mr. Cutter, I was not expecting you," he said, in the tone of a man who had practiced pleasantness until it was indistinguishable from the real thing. "Mrs. Dalton, I was in the area and thought I would pay a call." His eyes moved past her to the barn, to the repaired fence visible in the distance, to the general evidence of improved maintenance. "I see you have been busy," she said. "I have helped this season." He said, "Do you?" His eyes found James, who had stopped mending fence and was standing at a distance watching with a still and complete attention that was, to a man who understood the vocabulary of men who carried guns, its own kind of language. "I was not aware you had taken on a hand," she said. "I had not previously. Is there something I can do for you, Mr. Cutter?" he said. "I wanted to discuss the matter of the outstanding balance. I have been reviewing my accounts, and I am considering consolidating some of my longer-standing obligations." She said, "I have a payment for you today, as it happens." She went inside and came back with the envelope she had prepared after James's cattle sale. $200. That brings the balance to 212. He took the envelope with the practiced ease of a man who accepted money without showing either pleasure or surprise, and he looked at it and he said, "That is generous, Mrs. Dalton. I appreciate the effort." He paused. "However, I must tell you that I have been reviewing the terms of the original loan documentation, and there is a provision regarding the property as collateral that, given the outstanding balance, may require us to discuss a more structured arrangement." Virginia felt the familiar cold clarity she always felt when someone was trying to move something under her feet. She said, "What provision?" He said the original agreement included a standard territorial land security clause that gives the creditor, that is myself, certain options with regard to the collateral property if the outstanding balance is not resolved within a specified period. He smiled pleasantly. "The period in question expires at the end of this calendar year." She said, "The end of this year, that is 6 weeks from now." He said, "I am afraid so." I realize this may not have been entirely clear in the original documentation. These things can be complex. The pleasantness did not change. It was a fixed feature of his face, she thought, like a painted expression on something that was not actually alive. "I am quite willing to discuss options. An extension of the term in exchange for a deed transfer, for instance, would resolve the matter entirely." Virginia said, "I will not transfer the deed to my land." He said, "I understand your attachment, Mrs. Dalton, but the law," James Ford said, "what provision specifically?" He had walked up from the south fence line while Cutter was speaking, and he was standing at the gate now with the particular quality of stillness he had, the kind that was not absence of movement but presence of absolute readiness. And Cutter's 2 men had both shifted in their saddles with the specific adjustment of men recalibrating a situation. Cutter looked at James with the cool assessment of a man who dealt in power and could read it in other men. He said, "And you are," James said, "someone who has read enough loan agreements to know that standard territorial land security clauses require registration with the Territorial Land Office at the time of the original transaction to be enforceable. I will ask again, what provision specifically, and was it registered?" A silence that had considerable content. Cutter's smile did not change, but something behind it shifted. He said, "You are well informed for a ranch hand." James said, "I have been around. Was the provision registered?" Cutter said, "My lawyers are confident in the documentation." James said, "That is not an answer to my question." Virginia looked at James and then at Cutter and understood that what was happening was a specific kind of confrontation that operated entirely on the level of implication, each man communicating something that had nothing to do with loan agreements and everything to do with who was going to move first. Cutter said, "I will let my lawyers contact you formally, Mrs. Dalton. In the meantime, I am sure we can all remain reasonable." He put the envelope in his coat pocket and looked once more at James with the kind of look that was a message sent without a stamp. Then he turned his horse and rode back up the road with his 2 men behind him. Virginia waited until they were out of sight. Then she said, very quietly, "He is lying about the provision." James said, "Almost certainly. But he does not need to be telling the truth to cause you significant difficulty. He needs to file papers and create enough legal confusion to make your position untenable. And in this territory, a man with his resources can do that whether he is right or wrong." He turned to look at her. "We need to go to the land office in Santa Fe and review the original deed and the loan documentation," she said. "That is 3 days' travel." He said, "Yes." She said, "Esteban can watch the animals for a few days." She paused. "You think he is going to move against the property?" He said, "I think he came here today to assess whether you were vulnerable enough to move against and whether I was a significant obstacle." He paused. "I think he has decided I am." She said, "Are you?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That is not a small thing to say." He looked at her with those gray eyes that held the specific quality of a man who had arrived at a decision through difficult interior work and was now on the other side of it, clear and committed. He said, "No, it is not a small thing. I mean it to be a large thing." She said, "James." He said, "Virginia. I know I have no formal claim here. I know I have been on your property for 6 weeks and that my history is not clean and that I cannot offer you a life that is without complication." He stopped. He said it plainly, without performance. "I am in love with you. I do not say that to complicate the situation with Cutter. I say it because it is true, and I have been trying to find the right moment to say it, and I think the right moment might not arrive on its own, and I need to simply say it." Virginia stood in the cold November air outside her gate and looked at him, and felt the thing she had been managing for 6 weeks break open fully in her chest. The warm and terrifying recognition of it. The acknowledgement that she had been falling in love with him since approximately the second morning when he had drunk coffee on her porch in the cold, and told her what he thought about her gardening without any attempt to flatter her or be charming about it. Just honest, just attentive, just himself. She said, "I am in love with you too. That is also true." He crossed the space between them and took her face in both his hands and kissed her with the specific gravity of a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and was now entirely present in the having of it. And she kissed him back with the specific honesty of a woman who did not do anything at partial commitment. And the cold November morning was very bright around them. They rode to Santa Fe 4 days later, the delay being necessary because Virginia needed to prepare the operation for their absence, and because James needed to send a letter, which he wrote at her table and sealed and sent with the mail rider who came through every 2 weeks. She asked who he had written to, and he said a man named Henderson in Albuquerque, who had worked territorial law for many years, and who James had helped with a matter some time ago, and who he believed would be willing to advise on the documentation question. The ride to Santa Fe was 3 days, and they stopped at roadhouses, and once, on the second night, camped under a clear black sky that was so full of stars it seemed almost architectural. And they lay by the fire and talked until very late about things that had nothing to do with Cutter or deeds or debts. About what Virginia's childhood in Ohio had been like, and what James's mother had been like, and whether either of them believed in God, and what they thought the territory would look like in 20 years, and whether it was possible to build something genuinely permanent in a place that still felt so actively in the process of becoming. She said, lying on her back looking at the stars, "Do you think people can change? Not improve themselves in small ways, but actually change the fundamental direction of what they are?" He said, "I'm attempting to find out." She turned her head and looked at him in the firelight. She said, "I think you already have. I think the change happened before you sat at my table. I think sitting at my table was the first action of the changed version of you." He said, "That is a generous interpretation." She said, "It is an honest one." She paused. "Calvin Webb." He was quiet. She said, "You have been carrying him for 4 years. I want to tell you something about that." She sat up and looked at him directly. "What you did was wrong. You know that, and you carry it, and the carrying of it is evidence that you understand why it was wrong, but you were also deceived. You were given false information by a man who used you as an instrument. The responsibility for what happened to Calvin Webb is not only yours. Marsh bears the larger part." He said, "I pulled the trigger," she said, "because you were told a lie. A lie told to you by a man who knew you were decent enough to refuse to act if you knew the truth." She said it steadily, not to relieve him of responsibility but to place the responsibility accurately. "That is not absolution, but it is the truth. Marsh used your decency against you. That is his crime on top of yours." James Ford did not say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, slightly, the way a voice sounds when something that has been held at great tension is permitted to shift. He said, "I have never heard it framed that way." She said, "You have been framing it alone for 4 years. Sometimes a second framing helps." He reached across the firelit space between them and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while, and the stars burned overhead with their patient and ancient indifference, and the fire burned down, and after a time they slept. Santa Fe in November of 1883 was busy in the way of a territorial capital that was still negotiating its own nature. The old adobe architecture of the Plaza District living alongside newer frame buildings, and the ongoing conversation between the long-established Spanish and Mexican families who had been there for generations, and the Anglo population that had been arriving in increasing numbers since the railroad reached the territory. Virginia had been there twice before, once when she first arrived and once after Thomas's death, and both times she had found it overwhelming in its noise and its commerce after the particular silence of her land. This time it felt different. She moved through it with James beside her and the specific sense of a woman who had an ally, not a protector, an ally, and the distinction was important to her in a way she had not entirely articulated to herself until she felt the difference. They went to the Territorial Land Office and spent 2 hours with a clerk named Horace Whitfield, who was meticulous and somewhat beleaguered, and who pulled the original deed documentation and the registered loan agreement, and laid them on the counter with the care of a man who understood that what was on those papers mattered very much to the people looking at them. James read through the loan documentation carefully, slowly, with the focused attention of a man who read with complete presence, and then he said, "Here," he pointed at a clause, "the land security provision, and here is the registration notation." He looked at Virginia. "It is registered." He was not lying about that. Her stomach dropped. She said, "Then he has a legitimate claim at the end of the year." James said, "He has a claim." Whether it is legitimate depends on the interpretation of this term here, material default. He is arguing that the failure to repay in full by the deadline constitutes material default. but the original agreement also contains a standard right-to-cure provision, which requires the creditor to provide 30 days written notice before exercising the security clause. Horace Whitfield, who had been listening with the professional impassivity of a man accustomed to people discussing their crises over his counter, said, "The right-to-cure provision is standard. Has Mrs. Dalton received written notice?" Virginia said, "No written notice. He came to my property and spoke to me directly." Whitfield said, "Verbal notice does not satisfy the provision. He would need to file with this office and provide certified written notice before the security clause could be enforced." He paused. "If he does file, you would have 30 days from the date of notice to cure the default by paying the outstanding balance in full." James said, "What is today's date?" Whitfield said, "November the 18th. James looked at Virginia. He said, 6 weeks until the end of the year. If he files now and provides written notice, you have 30 days from notice, which could push the cure deadline into January." He paused. "How much is the outstanding balance after the payment you made?" She said, $212. He said quietly, "I have $240. She stared at him. She said, "Where did you?" He said, "I have been working for 6 weeks and I have received no wage. That is not where it is from. I have money from before. It is not clean money in the sense that it was earned in ways I am not proud of, but it is legal and it is real and I have it." He held her gaze. "Let me use it," she said. "James, that is everything you have." He said, "I know." She said, "If you spend that on my debt, you have nothing." He said, "I have the place I am staying. I have the work. I have." He stopped and then said it plainly, "I have you. Those are not nothing." Virginia Dalton stood in the land office in Santa Fe with its smell of paper and ink and the particular closed-window air of bureaucratic spaces, and looked at the man who had walked into her life through an unlocked door and sat at her table and told her he had not eaten a warm meal worth remembering. And she felt the full weight of what was happening, the terrifying and wonderful weight of it. The fact that two people could find each other in the great empty distance of the territory and build something that mattered. She said, "If we use your money and mine together, we have $452. That is more than the balance of 212. That is enough to pay it in full and have money remaining." He said, "Yes," she said, "I will not take your money as a gift. This will be a partnership." He said, "I intended it as a partnership." She said, "Say it plainly." He said, with that directness she had come to understand as the truest version of him, "I want to marry you, Virginia. I want to be your partner in every sense of the word. I want to be the person who sits across from you at that table you built yourself for the rest of my life." A pause. "I am asking, not assuming, asking." She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes, James Ford, I will marry you. And we will pay off Elias Cutter in full, and I will watch his face when we do it." They left the land office with a certified copy of the documentation and a recommendation from Whitfield to return to file the full payment and obtain a clear deed release. They found Henderson, James's contact in Albuquerque, who was in Santa Fe on his own business and who confirmed everything Whitfield had said about the right-to-cure provision, and added that Cutter's pattern of acquiring land through debt pressure was well known in territorial legal circles, and that the moment a full payment was made and properly documented, his claim was extinguished completely. They were married in Santa Fe 3 days later, in a civil ceremony performed by a justice of the peace named Arthur Boone, who had a drooping mustache and a serious demeanor, and who read the words with the care of a man who took the institution seriously. Virginia wore the better of her 2 dresses, which was blue wool, and James wore a clean shirt and his good coat, and had somehow in the interval acquired a small bunch of dried wildflowers that he presented to her before the ceremony with the slightly self-conscious air of a man who had not done romantic gestures very often, but was committed to attempting them. And she pressed them against her chest and looked at him with eyes that were very bright. They rode back to the property as husband and wife, and Virginia thought about the shape of that phrase, husband and wife, and found that it sat very differently than it had with Thomas. Not because she was comparing the two men, but because she was comparing two versions of herself. The woman who had come west at 25 following someone else's dream, and the woman who had stayed at 28 and built her own. And the latter woman's husband felt like a choice made from the fullest and most honest part of her. They arrived back at the property on a Sunday evening in early December to find Esteban Reyes waiting by the gate with an expression that told them something had happened. Said in his careful and precise English, 3 men came on Friday, Cutter's men. They walked around the property and made notes. I watched from the road. They did not come to the barn. James said, he is preparing to file. Esteban looked at Virginia and then at James with the sharp assessment of a man who was observant and had drawn his own conclusions about what had changed between them. He said, you went to Santa Fe to look at the documents. Virginia said, we did, and we were married. Esteban's expression shifted into something warmer than she had ever seen on his weathered face. He said, quietly, good. And then to James, with the directness of a man who protected the people he cared about, you will take care of her, James said. She takes care of herself. I intend to be beside her while she does it. Esteban looked at him for a moment and then nodded once slowly, the nod of a man revising an assessment favorably. He said, then I will tell my granddaughter that she should make more tortillas. They paid Elias Cutter on the 2nd of December. They rode into Redemption with the money in a locked box, and they went to Cutter's office above the bank, and James sat across from Cutter with the closed documentation from the land office. And he put $212 on the desk in counted and organized bills and said, this is the outstanding balance in full on the loan agreement dated March of 1881, held by Mrs. Virginia Dalton, now Mrs. Virginia Ford. He put the copy of the land office documentation on top of the money. You will provide a full release and a notation to the land office confirming the debt is satisfied. My wife and I will wait. Cutter looked at the money. He looked at the documentation. He looked at James Ford with those cool and pleasant eyes that held the specific quality of a man calculating the distance between his current position and his objective and finding it, for the first time, further than expected. He said, you have done your research, James said. My wife did her research. I confirmed it. Cutter looked at Virginia, who sat in the chair beside her husband with her hands in her lap and her face composed and her green eyes entirely steady. She said, the documentation, Mr. Cutter. He wrote the release. He did not do it graciously, but he did it correctly, because Cutter was many things, but he was not a man who would expose himself to legal liability when the game was clearly concluded. He signed the release, and he gave them the copy for the land office, and he took the money with the professional equanimity of a man who had lost one particular battle and was already thinking about the next. At the door he said, you have a formidable husband, Mrs. Ford. Virginia said, I have a partner, Mr. Cutter. Those are different things. She opened the door. I do not expect to be speaking with you again. They rode back to the property in the cold December afternoon with the debt gone and the land clean and clear. And when they came up the road, and the small house came into view with its smoke rising from the chimney, Esteban having kindled the fire for them, James reached across the space between their horses and put his hand over hers on the reins, and she turned and looked at him and smiled with her whole face, which was not something she did carelessly. And the late light caught her face, and he thought he would remember this moment with the specific and treasured precision he applied to things worth keeping. They came home to their house. That was how she thought of it now, their house, and the weight of that pronoun was not constraining but expanding, the way a good thing doubles when it is shared. December was cold and clear, and they worked the property together through the winter with the particular harmony of two people who had discovered that their working rhythms were compatible, which was a thing that sounded mundane but was, Virginia thought, one of the most significant compatibilities a partnership could have. They did not work identically. She was more methodical and patient. He was faster and better at improvised solutions. But they fit together like two sections of a completed thing, each supplying what the other lacked, neither requiring the other to be different. In the evenings they read by the fire, sometimes aloud to each other, sometimes separately, and they talked about what they had read and about other things, and they played cards, and James cooked supper twice a week, which he did with the focused intensity he brought to everything, and which produced results that ranged from very good to one memorable disaster, involving an attempt at a pie that had made them both laugh until they were incapacitated, which was itself a kind of gift. He told her more about his past, gradually, not all at once, but in pieces as the trust deepened, and the safety of the space between them became something they could both rely on. He told her about his brothers, both of whom were alive and established in Kansas City, and she told him he should write to them, and he did, and received a letter back from the older one, a man named Thomas Ford, which made Virginia laugh at the coincidence of names, that held a quality of relieved surprise that James had survived and found himself somewhere he intended to remain. She wrote to her parents in Ohio and told them she had remarried, and that the man she had married was someone she was confident about in ways she had not been confident before. Her mother wrote back with a letter that was equal parts joy and practical questions about the man's employment history and religious affiliation, and Virginia answered both with honesty and humor, and her mother's next letter contained a recipe for the apple cake that Virginia had been trying to replicate from memory since she left Ohio, which she made on a Sunday in January, and which James ate 3 pieces of and said was the best thing he had ever tasted, and she told him he was biased. And he said he was also correct. Spring arrived in March with the specific extravagance of the New Mexico territory, the desert blooming with an enthusiasm that always felt disproportionate to its winter austerity, and Virginia planted her garden with the expanded ambition that came from having a second pair of hands, and the knowledge that the land was completely and permanently hers. James purchased 6 additional cattle with the money from a second successful winter operation, bringing the herd to 14, and they began the process of applying for a proper grazing permit for the adjacent government land to the north that would double their available range. She was the one who told him about the baby on a Tuesday morning in April, sitting on the porch with coffee in the early light, presenting it with the characteristic directness she brought to all significant things, saying simply, "I believe I am with child. I expect it will be born in November." He was quiet for a moment that contained a great deal of movement beneath its surface. Then he turned to her and she saw in his face something she had seen glimpses of before, that unguarded quality, but larger than she had ever seen it, open all the way down to some place in him that was not armored or careful or managed, but simply present and alive. He said, "Virginia." She said, "I am very happy about it." He said, "So am I." He said it with a completeness that made the words sufficient. "So am I." The news moved through Millhaven with the speed of all significant frontier news, which was considerable, and Esteban Reyes arrived with his granddaughter Carmen, who was 17, and who brought 3 different dishes and instructions from Esteban that Virginia should not be doing heavy lifting, which Virginia received with the gracious patience of a woman who intended to continue doing exactly what she had been doing and simply not mention it. James, for his part, was not overprotective but was attentively practical, redistributing the physical demands of the operation between them without discussion, in a way that respected her autonomy entirely, while also clearly reflecting his investment in her well-being. And she thought this was exactly the kind of consideration she had not known to hope for when she was 23 and marrying Thomas in a church in Ohio, while her mother cried happy tears and her father looked proud, and neither of them knew what the frontier was actually like. She had not known what she was doing then. She had been doing the best she could with what she knew. She thought this was true of most people in most of their significant decisions, that you were always making choices with incomplete information, and the best you could do was be honest about what you did not know and stay open to correction when the missing pieces arrived. The correction the frontier had delivered to her was not gentle. It had taken her husband and given her a debt, and 3 years of solitude, and the specific education of a woman who had no one to rely on but herself. But it had also given her 50 acres of land that was genuinely hers and a kitchen garden, and a knowledge of her own capabilities that she would not have acquired in Ohio. And eventually, it had given her a cold October night and an unlocked door and a man who sat at her table and said he had not eaten a warm meal worth remembering. Summer passed with the heat of the high desert and the work of a cattle and garden operation that was producing well enough to save money for the first time, real savings, not the careful accounting of debt reduction but actual accumulation. And Virginia began thinking about the repairs and additions that the house would benefit from. A proper covered porch, a second room for the baby, better storage for the root vegetables that she had been keeping in a makeshift cellar that was functional but not ideal. James began building the second room in August, working in the evenings and on Sundays, and she helped him with the parts of it she could manage and supervised the parts she could not reach comfortably. And they argued mildly about the window placement because she wanted it to face east for the morning light, and he initially thought the west-facing wall was structurally simpler. And she explained why the morning light was important for a child's room, and he listened, and then agreed and figured out the east-facing window placement. And the argument lasted approximately 20 minutes and concluded with the agreement that had been the right decision, and also with her hand in his as they looked at the framing together in the late afternoon. She thought about the nature of disagreements in a partnership and how they were different when both parties were genuinely interested in the best outcome rather than in winning. And she thought this was something she had not fully understood before, and which she now considered one of the more important things she knew. The baby arrived on the 4th of November, which was a Sunday, which Virginia privately found satisfying in its thematic appropriateness. 1 year and 1 month after James Ford had sat down at her supper table and changed the shape of her life. He was born in the early morning with Carmen Reyes and the midwife from Millhaven, a capable woman named Mrs. Clara Hutchins, in attendance, and James was kept outside the room per convention, but could be heard by everyone in the house pacing the main room with a thoroughness that suggested he had counted the floorboards several times. When Clara Hutchins opened the door and told him he had a son, the sound he made was very quiet and very complete. She let him in and he came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held the small and serious person with the focused attention he brought to all things of importance, studying him with the specific reverence of a man who was understanding in real time that everything he had thought was permanent before was in fact still flexible and capable of being made more real. The baby was named William Reyes Ford, William for James's father, and Reyes for the neighbor who had watched over Virginia's land and Virginia herself for 3 years before James arrived. Esteban Reyes, when told the name, was quiet for a moment and then said, in Spanish first and then in English, "That is a good name. It is a name that means something." William was a serious baby who had James's gray eyes and Virginia's habit of looking at everything with complete attention before responding to it, which made Carmen Reyes say that he was already the most thoughtful baby she had ever seen, and which made both parents feel the particular amusement and recognition of seeing yourself reflected in someone who had barely arrived. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the hardest winter the territory had seen in several years, cold that came in October and stayed through April, and the cattle operation required constant attention, and there were 3 nights when James sat up until dawn monitoring the barn through temperatures that threatened the animals, and Virginia sat up with him on 2 of those nights because she was not going to sleep while he worked. And they kept each other company through the cold, dark hours, in the way of 2 people for whom company had ceased to be a matter of preference and become something more structural. The herd came through the winter with the loss of only 1 animal, which was a better result than most of their neighbors managed. And the spring brought a sense of having withstood something that strengthened the particular confidence that comes from weathered difficulty. That spring also brought a letter from James's brother in Kansas City, saying that he would like to visit, and Virginia wrote back that he was welcome. And when Thomas Ford arrived in June on the stage through Millhaven, he turned out to be a broad-shouldered man with James's coloring, and a wife named Ellen and 2 children aged 8 and 5. And the visit lasted 10 days and was, Virginia thought afterward, one of the best 10 days the house had held. Full of noise and meals that stretched to accommodate everyone and conversation that ran late into the evenings on the porch. Thomas Ford watched his brother with Virginia and with William, and at the end of the visit, when they were loading the stage, he held Virginia's hands in both of his and said, "He wrote to me 4 years ago, and the letter sounded like a man who had forgotten how to be in the world. The man I have spent 10 days with is someone different. Thank you for that," she said. "He did that himself." Thomas said, "He needed somewhere to do it." She thought about that after they were gone, thought about the idea of somewhere to do the difficult work of becoming yourself. And she thought that perhaps this was what a home was, not simply the structure but the specific quality of safety and honesty and consistent care that made internal change possible, that allowed a person to set down the things they had been carrying alone and look at them clearly and begin the work of becoming something different. James found her sitting on the porch after William was put to bed, and he sat beside her and asked what she was thinking, and she told him, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think you have been building that kind of home since before I arrived here. I think that is what I walked into, something you had made that was capable of holding difficult things without breaking." She said, "I did not know that was what I was building." He said, "That is often how the best things are made. You are not building what you planned, you are building what you are." She turned and looked at him in the July dusk, this man who had arrived in her life through an unlocked door and who had become, in less than 2 years, as much a part of her daily reality as the land itself. And she thought about the things that people kept and the things that passed and the way time moved differently in a life that was fully inhabited. She said, "I am going to have another baby." He looked at her. He said, "When?" She said, "February, I believe." He said, "February." He calculated something in his expression, and then he said, "William will be 15 months, she said. "He will be a good older brother. He is already very responsible." James laughed, which was a sound she loved because it came from an honest place and was not performed, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the evening came down blue and warm over the land that was theirs. The second baby, born on a cold February morning in 1886, was a girl. They named her Clara Mee Ford, Clara for Mrs. Hutchins, who had delivered both children with capable calm and who had become a friend in the way of capable and calm people who appear at important moments, and Mee for Virginia's mother, who had not yet made the journey west but who Virginia was increasingly hopeful would, her letters having lately taken on a quality of genuine curiosity about the territory that was distinguishable from her earlier expressions of worried concern. Clara was a different creature from her brother entirely, louder and more immediately expressive, announcing her opinions from the first day and holding them with conviction. And James said, watching her, that he believed she had inherited Virginia's complete attention with the volume turned considerably up. And Virginia said she thought this was probably accurate and also excellent. William, at 15 months, took his role as older brother with the seriousness he brought to all things, frequently observed sitting beside Clara's basket with a focused and proprietary attention that made everyone who saw it smile with the involuntary completeness of something genuinely wonderful. Virginia's parents came that summer. Her father, a tall man named George Dalton who had her eyes and her direct quality, arrived with her mother Martha on the stage in August and spent 3 weeks on the property. Martha Dalton cried when she held Clara and smiled with her whole face when William looked up at her with James's gray eyes and accepted being held with the serious assessment of a child evaluating a new development. She walked through Virginia's kitchen garden on the second day and said to Virginia quietly, apart from the men, "You built this." Virginia said, "I built this." Her mother said, "I was afraid for you after Thomas." Virginia said, "I know." Her mother said, "I should not have been, or at least I should have been afraid for the right reasons. I was afraid because you were alone. I should have understood that you were capable." Virginia looked at her garden, at the neat rows and the clay pots on the windowsill and the herb beds that had started small and expanded as she learned what the soil and climate would hold, and she said, "I needed to learn that myself. You could not have told me." Her mother looked at James, who was in the yard with her father and William, pointing at something in the distance while George Dalton looked in the same direction, and William sat on James's shoulders looking at whatever it was with complete engagement. Her mother said, "He is a good man." Virginia said, "He is." Her mother said, "How do you know?" Virginia said, "Because he told me the worst thing he had ever done within 2 days of knowing me. Because he listened when I spoke with the specific quality of a person who was actually interested in what I was saying. Because he treats the land with respect and the animals with care and the people around him with honesty." She paused. "Because when he is sitting across from me at the table and the light is right, he still looks like someone who cannot believe he is there, and every time I see that expression I remember that being lucky is not passive. You have to be ready for the lucky thing when it arrives." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are very different from the woman who left Ohio." Virginia said, "Yes, I am." Her mother said, "I think I prefer this version." Virginia said, "I prefer it too." George Dalton, before leaving, walked the property with his son-in-law and told James that Virginia had always been the most capable of his 3 children, and the least willing to accept limitations placed on her capabilities, and that whoever was beside her needed to understand that her capabilities were not a thing to manage, but a thing to appreciate. And James said he had understood this from the second morning, and George Dalton shook his hand and said that was the correct answer. By the autumn of 1886, 3 years after James Ford had sat down at Virginia's table without permission and eaten her supper, the operation had expanded to 22 cattle, a fully productive kitchen and kitchen garden, a proper cellar, a covered porch, 2 additional rooms, a small smokehouse, and the beginning of a modest apple orchard on the east side of the property that Virginia had planted from stock ordered through the seed catalog she had read until it fell apart and replaced with a new one. The debt to Elias Cutter was long satisfied. Cutter himself had departed the territory the previous year under circumstances that the Millhaven Gossip Network reported as involving a legal dispute with the Territorial Land Office regarding several of his more aggressive acquisitions, a dispute that had cost him considerably, and which Virginia received the news of with a calm and complete satisfaction that she allowed herself to feel without guilt. Esteban Reyes's health had been declining through the summer, an issue with his lungs that the doctor in Millhaven attributed to decades of dust exposure, and Virginia and James had been quietly absorbing more of the daily maintenance of his property while he rested, and Carmen was there every day now, and the understanding between all of them, unspoken but clear, was that Esteban's plot would eventually become part of the Ford operation, and Carmen would have a place there for as long as she wanted it. Esteban said to James one afternoon, sitting on his porch in the September sun with a clarity that the dying sometimes access, "I told her about Cutter because I was worried." "I did not know if you were good," James said. "I was not certain either." Esteban said, "You became good, that is more valuable." He died in October quietly, in the bed Carmen had kept for him, and they buried him on the hill above his property in the sight of the mountains he had looked at his whole life. And Virginia stood at the grave with William beside her and Clara in her arms and James on her other side, and thought about the nature of the people who made a place what it was, the ones who did not get written into the official histories, but who were present and essential and irreplaceable. And she thought that Esteban Reyes had been one of those people, and that she would not let the fact of his living here be forgotten. She planted a tree for him in the spring, a cottonwood beside the spring where the water ran east across her property, which would grow tall and provide shade for the cattle and for anyone who came to sit beside the water. And she told William, who was nearly 3, that the tree was for a man named Esteban who had watched over their land and their family, and who deserved to be remembered by something that grew and gave shade to others. William, who was considering this with his characteristic seriousness, said, "Does the tree know it is for him?" Virginia said, "We know, that is what matters." William thought about this and nodded once, in the same way his father nodded when he had processed something and arrived at a conclusion. And Virginia felt the love she had for both of them move through her with a force that she did not attempt to contain or manage but simply let be what it was, enormous and ordinary, and the central fact of her life. On the 3rd anniversary of James's arrival, which was the first week of October 1886, Virginia made rabbit stew. She made it deliberately, with the same root vegetables and dried herbs in the same pot, and she set it on the table for 2 at supper. And when James came in from the barn, he stopped in the doorway of the main room and looked at the table and then at her, and she saw in his face the full recognition of it. He sat down at the table. He looked at the bowl she set in front of him. He looked at her, sitting across from him, and she had her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she was looking at him with those green eyes that had never lost their clarity or their directness, and which he thought about every morning when he woke up as the first good thing. He said quietly, "I have not eaten a warm meal worth remembering," she said, "then I will keep making them." He said, "You already have, everyone," she said, "eat your supper, James." He ate. Outside, the first stars were coming up over the New Mexico territory in the October dark, and in the second room, William was asleep with the consolidated seriousness of a small person with important things to do tomorrow, and Clara was in her basket near the fire making the small sound she made when she was deciding whether to sleep or announce an opinion, and the fire was burning clean, and the stew was warm, and the house was full of the particular quality of light that comes from a life that has been, against considerable odds and through genuine difficulty, and with more love than either of its builders had thought to hope for, made into exactly what it was always meant to be. James Ford sat at Virginia's table, at their table, in the house they had built together on the land that was fully and freely theirs, and he ate a warm meal worth remembering. And this time he was home.